So they give you your old buttons back here. You still got to show us how to have the screen work.
They said it's been reprogrammed. Now, I haven't been. So, I don't know how it's all going to work, but we're going to give it a go. Actually, I sent in the wrong slideshow, but I can make it work anyway, for some odd reason. So good day. My name is John Korstein. I'm Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center at the Mariners Museum and Park, and I'm here to tell you all about the Ironclad building program in Alabama. Now, just kind of to get your mind focused, Alabama, as you know, has great resources of iron and coal. Iron and coal means what? I can roll iron plate. I should be able to make engines. I should be able to actually make an iron-hulled boat. Well, that sounds very good. The trouble is, it's not until really the late 1840s and early 1850s that the South began to realize that, wow, why are we doing these finished goods or these raw materials and sending them up to the North for them to send back to us? In fact, Edmund Ruffin said that makes us enslaved to the North. And so there was this movement to try and utilize those natural resources that they had in the South. And one of those places that's going to happen is in Alabama. Just remember, we have the rising industrial centers such as Birmingham, Selma, Montgomery. And these are very, very important because they're all on rivers that go down to Mobile Bay, right? The trouble is, a little further north is where the iron deposits are and where the coal deposits are. So the Confederates have an issue, as I'll probably tell again today, that they have a transportation problem. And their transportation problem is that they start building railroads and creating a network. The trouble is that each state said, well, no, we're going to have a 5-foot gauge. And other states said, well, no, we're going to have a 4-foot 3/8 gauge, and so forth. So that means when you get to the next state, what do you have to do? You got to get everything off the track and put it here. Now, Alabama does have some pretty good opportunities because of its because its nearness to towns like Atlanta, which had one of the second largest um, ironworks in the South, and that would be Slocum and Markham. And they get overused because, you know, after the battle between the Monitor and the CSS Virginia, there is a rush to build ironclads. We see it up in the north. However, the north is better prepared to build many ironclads at one time. The South is not. And so the need for iron plate that has to be rolled and produced are most of those links are 8 feet. Okay. And so they have to roll that plate, put it on a railroad, take it to a river that they put it on a barge, and then send it down to where it's needed. The great example is there is this huge need for ironclads in the South because they recognize that every port, major port in the South, can only be protected not just by coastal fortifications, but more importantly, by um, you know, ironclads. Okay. Because you got, once a Union fleet passes your forts, like at Port Royal Sound, what do you have to stop them? Well, nothing. So there's this big rush. Now, just remember, the Confederates are able to put 23 ironclads in the water. That doesn't mean they all work well. That doesn't mean they're all properly armored. But still, this is a testament to the ingenuity and the improvisation of materials at hand, typically in the South. Now, this is the best ironclad built in the South. And I questioned that at first, but then I read Alfred Mahan wrote an article and said this was the combination of everything the Confederates could do to make their ironclads successful. This is the CSS Tennessee. We're going to talk a lot more about it in just a moment. But as you can see, it's a pretty powerful looking ironclad, 207 feet in length. It had believe it or not, it could go 6 knots, but we'll get into all that in just a bit. Now, the big idea is that you can see where Mobile Bay happens to be. Whoa. Now, the maps that show the railroad connections, very bad. This shows the interstate connections, all right? However, they kind of mirrored the railroad connections. So all roads lead to where? Mobile Bay. So if we look at this map east of the Mississippi of available ports on the Gulf of Mexico, what do you see? You see New Orleans, actually Mobile Bay, and Pensacola. Now, Mobile had become a very cosmopolitan city by 18. Whoops, I don't want to go there yet. By 1860 census, had 25,000 people living there, which is big. Just think, Richmond has 33,000 people. So this is a big commercial city. It's been controlled by the Spanish, controlled by the French, controlled by the British, controlled now by the Americans. So you have a more cosmopolitan feel when you are in Mobile. In fact, some of the officers in the squadron, Mobile Bay squadron, said, "Oh yeah, it was great. After I got off watch," this is according to George Gift, "I would take a small boat into Mobile, and there we could have lunch at this person's place. We could, meet with these people. And of course, they had oyster bars. And where you have oyster bars, you also have what? Liquor bars. So in fact, people would give away oysters for you to come and drink. You had to pay for the beer. So that just shows you how prevalent this all is. So Mobile is a pretty advanced place. Because of that, um, we will recognize that when David Glasgow Farragut conquers New Orleans, all of a sudden, Mobile becomes the most important port on the Gulf Coast. Now, I say that because number one, Gulfport isn't deep enough. Pensacola had been taken over by the Confederates. However, because the Union retained Fort Pickens on Santa Rosa Island, that Pensacola would eventually fall. This was a great harbor. They had a shipyard there and everything the Confederates needed. And so when New Orleans falls, we see that Mobile becomes the most important port for blockade runners. Now, Mobile has been defended before the war. Now, I got to tell you, Mobile was fought over during the War of 1812, during the American Revolution. So it's an important place. So the United States says, oh gosh, we're going to build a big fort there. This is part of the third system of coastal defense. So this is Fort Morgan, probably the most important of those forts. It could mount 44 guns. It actually had a water battery that had 20 guns in it, including Brooke rifles, 42-pounder Columbiads. In other words, it's a powerful fort. It is in a little narrow, so you can see right here. I'm only spending time on the forts: Fort Morgan, Fort Gaines, which you'll see in Fort Powell. This is the entrance to Mobile Bay, and in fact, the ship channel. Oops. Comes right like this. In fact, it comes very close to that's the Deepwater ship channel. Okay, so it comes right next to Fort Morgan. That's what makes it so important. However, the Confederates, this is Fort Gaines, also built as part of the third system of coastal defense. Let me tell you, they're right across the harbor from or the entrance from each other, which meant that they could actually control or fire at these ships coming in. So they could crossfire them. So, and then there's Fort Powell, which was pretty pathetic, and it guarded this thing called Grant's Pass, which was the pass that led from Mobile Bay into the Mississippi Sound. In other words, you had a protected way to go from Mobile Bay to New Orleans. And this is one of the reasons why we got to have ironclads. And of course, those defenses are going to be enhanced by the development of torpedoes. Now, we're not here to talk about torpedoes, but what we do want to talk about is what are we going to do if Federals get past those forts? And so they decide they are going to start building ironclads. Now, one of the big problems with Mobile Bay is at first, no one pays attention to it. They actually have a lieutenant, James Johnston, who is in charge of the lighthouse at Fort Morgan. That's his real duty. And then when the war breaks out, he's there and he's kind of motivated to try to create defenses for Mobile Bay. So he's going to start building wooden gunboats or acquiring gunboats that have good engines and put cannons on them. This is a typical thing that the Confederates like to do. However, Johnson is going to also want to have an ironclad. Now, Johnson is a line officer, been at sea. He is not a designer. Sadly, the folks in Mobile, Bassett uh, Company, which had a shipyard, said, "Don't worry, we can make you an ironclad." And this is the one they come up with, known as the Baltic. The Baltic is very, very bad. Uh, its engines were built in Philadelphia. It was launched in 1860 as a river transport vessel. It had 624 tons, length of 186 feet, beam 38 feet, draft 6.5. It was a side wheeler, high pressure engine. And so the armor, wow, this is going to be impressive. It had 2 inches on the deck and covering the paddle wheels, and 4 inches forward of the paddle wheel uh, that you can see. Now, this is not all but so accurate. However, the ship could only make 5 knots, and that was on a good day. So if you just picture the Baltic going up against a monitor, you recognize it's not going to last very long. In fact, Johnson and several other officers, like Charles Carroll Sims, will call it a punk ship. And so it was left for derision only. Basically, the Confederates are going to build these wooden ships. They have the Baltic as really holding the center for the defense of Mobile Bay. This is not good. Now, at first, I have to tell you, Johnson is going to be superseded in command by a man known as Flag Officer Victor Randolph. And Victor Randolph, I have to tell you, hates the Secretary of Navy, Mallory, because Mallory had him put on reduced pay and retired from the Navy because of his age. Actually, Buchanan was on that board that said Victor Randolph, he is nothing but an old woman, and says some other bad remarks. I'll go ahead and say this one. He was only fond of cabin boys. And so, we'll deal with it. Charles Grave described Randolph as a charming old gentleman in the parlor, very amiable, very kind and polite in his manners, and you cannot help liking him. But he is 65 years old and hasn't all the fire of youth, and at best never was known or was remarkable for his energy or decision. So Randolph is given the job of not only defending Mobile Bay, but also taking a force led by the Baltic up the Mississippi Sounds to capture New Orleans back from the Federals. So I want to remind you all that Farragut, when he does capture New Orleans, he believes that he should then attack Mobile Bay. However, the powers to be will say, no, you're going to take your ships up and help capture Vicksburg, because in the mind of Abraham Lincoln, the most important thing was have the Mississippi flow unvexed to the sea because of all the commerce in, Illinois and so forth. They needed that river open to have economic possibilities. So Randolph, smart as he is, does nothing. And he really concentrates on building the wooden ships, the Crescent, the Gaines, the Morgan. However, these were nothing, as Randolph said himself, but cockle shells, as one well-directed shot would cripple them. And so it is, and this, you got to tell you, in 62, most of the blockaders off of Mobile Bay were sailing ships. So, in other words, the Confederates have an opportunity to really break the blockade with concerted effort. Victor Randolph does none of that. And so we'll see him replaced by one of our great heroes of the Confederate Navy, and that is Buchanan, Franklin Buchanan. And so he has just been promoted to admiral for his exploits in Hampton Roads. He is then comes down to sign to Mobile Bay. He's still on crutches, but nevertheless, he is a dynamo, and he tells Randolph to get out of my way. And Randolph is upset because he is more senior than Buchanan in the Confederate Navy. You can't say that to me. And so he's shipped off and is court-martialed and doesn't do anything else in the war. So what happens is that the Confederate Navy had to build shipyards in Mobile, not in Mobile, but up the rivers coming into Mobile. And the main rivers is the Tuscaloosa and the Alabama River. Just think, the Alabama River has on its shores Selma, which has an iron rolling factory, and the Confederates also will start building a gun factory there. And here's, of course, here's our hero, Victor Randolph. Franklin Buchanan, and he really pushes the building of ships forward. Now, the trouble is that Colin McRae was the purchasing agent for the Confederate Navy. He pushed forward the Selma gun factory, and also Selma gun factory was part of an overall complex that was 300 acres, believe it or not. And it is designed to build several ships, make the iron plate, make the engines, and so forth. The big trouble is the engines did not work very well. So most of these Confederate ships built in Alabama are going to be built using steamboat engines. What does it say? The worthless, it's the Tuscarora and Huntsville, lying off the city of Mobile. And it's sketched by George Gift. And so this looks like a powerful ironclad, right? But because they had to use high pressure engines and use them to run a propeller, that means you don't have as much power given to the propeller. And as a result of that, guess what? You only go 3 knots. Now, 3 knots, in my opinion, means you can't stem the tide. So Selma, now, Ebenezer is going to be placed in command of the construction efforts by James Buchanan, very talented officer who had been in the Navy 38 years. He actually was executive officer at the Pensacola Navy Yard when the war broke out. He had served at other Navy yards, and so he understood the construction, design, and production of these ironclads. And so he is the perfect man in the perfect place. Buchanan says, go find places to build these ironclads. And so basically, Ebenezer will pick Selma, and another place called Oven Bluff, Alabama. And that's where they lay down all sorts of ships. You have to realize that at Oven Bluff alone, uh, which is on the Tombigbee River, had organized the construction of two propeller ironclads and one large sidewheel armored vessel, and wanted to build another one in Montgomery. Actually, by September, the Confederates had 7 ironclads under construction in 1863. Okay. And that's a real testament to their desire. The trouble is, they don't have the wherewithal to really produce the ships you need. Now, I'm going to explain the Huntsville, and the Tuscaloosa is also the same ship exactly. So Bassett and Sons was a shipbuilder in Mobile who set up a shipyard in Selma. So Huntsville and Tuscaloosa is going to be built in Selma, Alabama. They are going to be 152 feet in length, 34-foot beam, 7-foot draft. And once again, the machinery is going to be a 1-screw high pressure engine. And it has, right? Now, this is incorrect because it only got mounted with 6 guns. This shows more than that, but they were on pivot mounts. The big thing is it's got 4 inches of iron, but as I said before, it could only go 3 knots. So believe it or not, these boats will come down the Alabama River to come all the way to Mobile Bay under their own power. But you want to go with the tide and so forth. And so, and all these rivers had so much overhang. It is amazing to see them traverse these narrow rivers as they did. Basically, Selma does not really end up being able to produce engines. So every one of these boats, now in this case, the Huntsville has 3 32-pounder shell guns and 1 6.4-inch Brook gun. Now, the Brook gun is important because these guns were taken from existing fortifications. But why they had Selma was to make their own Brook guns, because the Brook gun was the most important naval rifle during the Civil War. So Selma never really rolls any iron plate. So where am I going to get the iron plate from? Slocum and Markham, which is up in Atlanta. And of course, people in Savannah, people in Charleston all want that same rolled iron plate. As Buchanan will say, it is all a question of iron and time. How the Confederates can utilize these bad transportation networks, because as you all know, the Confederate or Southern railroad system is starting to fall apart. You can't run through the blockade. Railway cars, guess where all the locomotives and railway cars were acquired? They were acquired from the north, right? And so this means that the railroads are, in essence, falling apart. In fact, many Confederates liked to pull up rails, and instead of fixing railroads, they like to turn it into iron plate. I think one of the funniest examples is as they're building the Albemarle and the Noose in North Carolina, they said, where are we going to get the iron? And Daniel Harvey Hill says, we're going to take the iron from the railroads that are leading into alien territory. In other words, they pulled up the rails of of railroads that were going to, let's say, New Bern and Little Washington and so forth. So instead of taking care of their railroad system, it becomes extremely rickety. You're supposed to be able to go 25 miles per hour, which was huge back then. And the speeds were cut down to less than 10 miles because how dangerous the rails were, the lack of maintenance, maintenance crews for railroads, they just didn't have them because the South had a huge problem with transportation and manpower. So this is the Selma gun factory, which is part of the entire Selma naval complex. This is after the Yankees came or the Union came. They, of course, burned it, but it was so desperate for that to start building guns, especially Brook guns, that they'll actually build 200 here. And, creating a Brook gun was a huge process, which I've explained before. They're banded, sometimes double and even triple. The man that's running this factory is Catesby Ap Roger Jones. The Navy takes it upon himself to control the production of these guns. They will produce 200 guns, but just think all the needs that are at hand. And so, as I said, it's a question of iron and time to kind of counter the Federals. Now, Buchanan was also faced by various labor personnel problems, and as well as sailor problems. The lack of trained sailors to crew his ships would run his shipbuilders. He had to have great difficulty in securing men from the army. He simply could not man all of his ships without transfers. However, the generals said, we don't want to transfer any men to the Navy. The Navy hasn't done anything for us. And then the quality of the men who was transferred was very poor. In fact, Buchanan will write Flag Officer John K. Mitchell, who was commander of the James River Squadron in Richmond, that aboard some of the greatest vagabonds you'll ever read of. And in other words, they were the lower dregs, and most of them were foreigners, Irish, Norwegian, you just name the new immigrants, and they ended up on these boats with no sailor experience. So, Admiral Buchanan still believed in corporal punishment. Okay. He thought it was a good idea. And he said a well-disciplined ship was a good ship. And since most of the recruits had no sea experience and had to adjust to naval discipline, many deserted. Buchanan writes Mitchell, one or two such should be hung. And if that happened, the wonderful effect would stop them deserting. In other words, you get caught, you get hanged. If we can only, he writes, use the lash, we would have no trials for desertion or theft. Wow. Now, he had an excellent group of officers, Ebenezer Farragut, Lieutenant George W. Griff, who was called a fine officer, Lieutenant John Randolph Eggleston, a clever man, according to Buchanan. James D. Johnson was considered critical to the well-being of the squadron and would be promoted over several others as commander, the rank of commander, and became captain of the CSS Tennessee, too. Now, there were some officers, though, he would write Mitchell, some of these guys I wish I could send elsewhere, but they don't wear the proper uniform. He was a real stickler, and so if you didn't have the proper uniform, See, some Confederates were still wearing their blue uniforms. They just changed buttons. And so Buchanan wouldn't have any of that. So basically, by the late 1863, two major ironclads are nearing completion. And one is going to be the Nashville, and the other one is the CSS Tennessee 2. Now, it was built in Selma by Bassett. It had a tonnage of 1,273 tons. It was 209 feet in length, 48 feet beam, and a draft of 14 feet. Now, the machinery originally planned they were going to have paddle wheels and two propellers. So they said, no, that's not going to work. And so they take engines from a steamboat, adjust them, and basically use them for the Tennessee. Now, they thought that the Tennessee, as I quoted Alfred Mahan earlier, was the best ship in the Southern Confederacy. And so that ship could go 6 knots. And when you think about 6 knots, the Monitor could only go 7 knots. So you got the picture that these ships, although are awesome, going 6 knots is like speeding in a speedboat today, but not so much back then. So the Tennessee, this is kind of accurate, but then again, not. That no one gets some of these ships right. But you can see the pilot house. This ship actually, the design was created by Chief Naval Constructor William Graves, and it is very similar in class to the CSS Texas and the CSS Columbia. Columbia is built in Charleston, and Texas was under construction in Richmond. They're called diamond ironclads because if you're up in the air and look down at it, it looked like the shape of diamond, the facets. Why they did that is to lessen the weight of the guns. Now, the Tennessee had a full armament, and actually it had 2 7-inch Brook guns and basically 6.4-inch Brook guns. So that's a powerful armament. Now, remember, the fuses and the ammunition is all being made up in Selma, right? Then it's brought down to Mobile, where it will be stored. And if you're in Mobile, it's very humid, it's very damp, and so they put it in a warehouse, which was not smart to do. But anyway, and so Buchanan's trying, once he gets the Tennessee down to Mobile, he now has to fit it out. And he complained about every worker going. The idleness of workers has caused remarks by citizens, and I have been obliged to make a short speech, but a strong one to the men. He then claimed that Joseph Pierce was just a perfect old woman. Pierce delayed the work on the Tennessee by putting on the iron in the wrong way. Okay, so they had to take it all off. The workers also were a major problem. And Pierce also was known to not always be at the shipyard. In fact, he liked going to the Crescent Bar in Mobile. And so if you really wanted to find him to tell him something, you had to go there. And and Buchanan has to deal, because ship constructors are a rarity in the South. So he's got to stick with them. Now, all of a sudden, the carpenters at Selma will go on strike, and Buchanan is kind of upset. So the carpenters leave Selma and come down by boat going to Mobile, where they think they can get higher wages. And Buchanan hears about this. He sends up a bunch of CS Marines, right? and they capture all those guys and haul them off to a guardhouse. Buchanan then threatened to turn them over to the army, and then they agreed to go back to work. However, they were surly and sultry, as Buchanan wrote Mitchell, and that he then went to all of them and gave a great speech saying that they have to go back to work, and if they don't, I'll conscript you into the army. Instead, he conscripted them into the Navy. And so they had to work under direct Navy control. These carpenters do not like that. But somehow we've got to get these ships done and out to sea. So the next one that's brought down to Mobile is going to be the Nashville. Now, the Nashville is a huge vessel. It is 1,100 tons. It has a length of 171 feet, 62 feet beam, and an 11-foot draft. It had side wheels to high pressure engines. It could make 5 knots and had 3 7-inch brook guns and 1 24-pounder howitzer. Now, they intended to put 6 inches of armor on the casemate and then 2 inches on the paddle boxes and the deck, which was a big mistake. As we know, the Federals are going to eventually come, and Buchanan has done everything he can to get his ships ready for action. The Nashville doesn't have the armor. They can't get the armor. So they actually take apart the armor from the Baltic, but it's not enough. So it cannot go into action. Whereas the Confederates were building 7 ironclads, they only have 3 at Mobile Bay capable of serving, and 2 of them could not serve in an active battle situation. So we can see the Tennessee, remember it goes 6 knots. However, these monitors go 9 knots. Those sloops can make as much as 13 knots. So Buchanan tries to cut off their advance into the Mobile Bay on August 5th, 1864, and he can't catch up to them, right? They all pass him by. So the Tennessee was typical of what could have been had the Confederates, despite all the resources that were available to them, if they could only get them into these shipyards, they would have had a major fleet that could have not only defended Mobile Bay, but perchance could have liberated New Orleans. Problems with these ships that were being built, guess what? Number one, they were underpowered. Number two, we didn't have enough iron to plate them properly. And number three, the crew members were not very well, none of them had been to sea, let's put it that way. And so this was a weakness that plagued the Confederates a great deal. So, the conclusion of all this is that when you look at a list of resources in states, you can see that Alabama has everything it needs to make iron, to build ships. The problem is it did not have the facilities to take those two resources and turn them into iron plate. It did not have anywhere to build engines. So every one of these ships are going to have poor engines or weak engines, as we'll say. Why build a floating battery when you could have built an ironclad such as the Huntsville? So they had different purposes. So remember, the Confederates had 7 ironclads under construction. Only one of those is ready for battle, And the Nashville is not properly armored, and it's sitting there off the at a shipyard, Bassett Shipyard in Mobile, that is unable to do anything. And so the Mobile Bay Squadron is typical of many of the Confederate squadrons, that they don't have enough iron engines and actually trained crew to make ironclads an important part of their defense. The Tennessee was feared by Farragut. However, it would never it was just not, when you have one against the size of the fleet. Remember, he's got 4 monitors against one Confederate ironclad. That does not result. This is one of the Union ironclads. This is the Manhattan class. And of course, you can see what happens. One ironclad cannot take on an entire fleet. Okay. So, any questions? Okay. Yes, sir.
I understand that during the Battle of Mobile Bay, a lot of the torpedoes that the Confederates had, the chemicals were old or malfunctioned. Otherwise, that battle may have turned out real different.
Well, yes. I'm surprised that one blew up, actually. But they had several different ways of, just remember, we're using beer kegs or tin that we cover with tar and trying to make them waterproof. And then we have to have where the ship goes over a little ignition system. And that's a glass with fulminate of mercury covered with tar. And a tar erodes away with tides. So the heavy tides coming in and out of Mobile Bay meant many of them needed replacement. And the Confederates did not have the wherewithal to go out there and replace these torpedoes. In fact, during the Battle of Mobile Bay, right, you see the Richmond, behind that's the Hartford. Remember, they now realize they're in the torpedo field. And being in the torpedo field, like James Alden stops his ship. Farragut, of course, says, damn the torpedoes. And as they go over the torpedo field, some said they could hear the clicking of the ignition system for the torpedoes. Now, I don't know. It's okay. I don't know how you heard that over the steam engines. Thank you. The cannon and everything like that. But they said so. And so it's a good story. Yes.
In all of your lectures I've been to and books that I've read from you and others, you kind of answered one of my questions, but was how many total do you estimate that the South had of ironclads? And then the second part of that would be, did anybody in the South ever sit down with the Navy and say, if we could get it all together and go up the Potomac, we could bomb, we could missile, we could launch on DC? Did any of that ever come to?
Well, the question is, how many ironclads did the Confederates produce? And why didn't the Confederates have a grand strategy for their Navy? And I'll answer that in 2 parts. Number one, they are able to put 23 ironclads in the water, which is amazing. And the places they put them in the water, Richmond, Norfolk, North Carolina Sounds, Wilmington, Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and New Orleans. The ones in New Orleans just weren't finished. Otherwise, they may have been able to block Farragut's move up the river. But, and they were of poor design. I don't know how well they would have worked. The second question is, why didn't they go ahead and get their ironclads together and attack Washington up the Potomac? Okay. And that sounds like, wow, what a great idea. In fact, when they were transforming the Merrimack into the Virginia, they said, you see this correspondence that Mallory says, oh, the Virginia will be like a bayonet charge of infantry. Once you destroy the Union fleet in Hampton Roads, you should go up to Washington or up to New York and terrorize them. Buchanan said, you can't do that. And he said you can't do that because the draft of the Virginia was 22 feet. And of course, the Potomac, you have a lot of trouble going up with that type of draft. You run aground a lot and so forth. And actually taking the Merrimack out to sea would not, it's top heavy or comproquitted, as one person said, with all the armor, 790 tons of armor on a somewhat sheer hull. Now, it doesn't look sheer when you look at it, but it is because the Merrimack had been designed to be a sailing ship and steamship. And you can't have those two type of motive powers and expect to have a really effective warship. Well, you could, but the big thing is that it changes the design of the vessel itself. I would have to say the Confederates did not have an ocean-going ironclad, and they wanted one so bad, but they lacked the industrial resources, the engines particularly, to actually send them up. And by summer of 1862, it's way too late. And the Virginia was intended to go out to sea. But once it got all finished, they recognized, well, it's not going to really float. In fact, it's lucky it didn't turn turtle during the Battle of Hampton Roads. It was such a smooth surface that nothing could stop its moving. So if we had a day like yesterday in Hampton Roads, the Virginia would not have been out of Norfolk or Gosport Navy Yard.
Just a follow on to that question. that memo from Mallory to Buchanan. Did maybe Mallory already know that, but he did that because he knew he had a mole, and that was.
That's exactly. So the question is, why did Mallory write that letter? Did he already know the weaknesses of the Virginia? Well, yes. As soon as they flooded the dry dock, Catesby Jones, John Mercer Brooke kind of recognized the real big problems with the Virginia. And Mallory wasn't positive who it was or if it really was, but he thought he had a spy. So by sending a letter to Buchanan that said, hey, next thing you do after sinking the federal fleet, go up to New York. Of course, the Federals say, oh my gosh, this is a super weapon. In fact, on March 8th, 1862, the Virginia was a super weapon. And had the Tennessee been fighting just wooden ships, it would have been a super weapon. But against another ironclad, it was not. So that threat, the threat of the Virginia going up the Potomac was so real that Edwin Stanton, during a cabinet meeting, kept pulling the curtains aside and looking out, expecting the Merrimack, as he would have called it, to be there ready to shell the Capitol. It couldn't have done that. So in answer, I do believe there was a spy in the Navy Department, Confederate Navy Department. And also, they just couldn't design the ships to meet the requirements of harbor defense and riverine warfare versus going to sea. Okay, that takes different type of ships to do different jobs. A Monitor was not intended to go to sea. It was a harbor defense vessel. As a result of that, that's why, a lot of them sank in heavy seas, it just wasn't a design made to combat 30-foot waves. And so, yeah. Any other questions?
I have one about having such a tall smokestack. Wouldn't that make the ship vulnerable if it was hit or struck?
Say that again, please.
With having such a tall smokestack, wouldn't that make the ship vulnerable if it was hit or struck?
Sure. And it was. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, this vessel right here will have its rudder chains shot away, so it couldn't steer. It had its smokestack not only filled with holes, but also shot off. You know, it fell down, and its port shutters were all jammed. And so the higher smokestack meant nothing. Now, when the Federals build the Passaic class, they have what they call our armored smokestacks. And wow, that's pretty good. But it was, 2 inches of iron. It doesn't really work for me. And as part of the defense. So the smokestacks was a very vulnerable part of any ship, wooden or iron. So that's why we see like the Virginia loses speed because its smokestack is riddled in its fight with the USS Cumberland. And the Albemarle has problems with its smokestack on the June 5th, 1864 battle with the Union North Carolina Squadron in Albemarle Sound. And so it has to limp back. They actually, to get enough power, they had to throw turpentine, cotton waste, and furniture and whatever they could to keep that pressure up with the engine. Because with a riddled smokestack, you are losing, the ability to push that, get rid of the residue of steam that is from firing the boilers. So the boilers can't release enough of that used air, I'll call it, then it's going to stay down in the ship. And I don't know about you all. I want you all to go out and look at the casemate of the Virginia in the Monitor Center. And you'll see if smoke is filled with that, you're in big trouble. In fact, 2 crew members talk about it, and because also the Confederates always put ship's grease on the side of their armor to help deflect shot. And so Jack Hunt turns to John Cronin and says, because you got shells blowing up on the side of the Virginia, right? And then you got a riddled smokestack, and then you got all the cannon fire, and then you have bacon, right? Ship's grease is made out of a lot of pork fat. And so one turns to the other, says, "Don't it smell like hell?" And the retort was, "Yeah, and we'll soon be there." And it was an iffy duty to be on a Confederate ironclad and to be on a monitor, actually. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Just to follow on about the torpedoes/mines in Mobile Bay,
Mm-hmm.
did Farragut have some kind of advanced intelligence to say, I think those things won't work, or was he just playing a hunch? Or
He was playing a hunch. And, he was just like Buchanan. There's the enemy. We're going to go get him. And so if one ship gets sunk by the torpedoes, or if one of the wooden ships got sunk by the torpedoes, what are we going to do? Well, let it sink and then try to move around it.
every ship a minesweeper once.
Yeah. But actually, the Richmond had a device designed by Erickson on it called a devil's raft, which looked like a triangle that fitted on the hull, and it had grapples to catch the torpedoes and pull them away from the progress of the ship. But that devil raft didn't work. I think I have a lecture coming up about DuPont's attack on Charleston, and I can go into more detail about it. It was a crazy idea, but if it came from Erickson, it had to be good. And so, that's one of the big problems we have. Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned Atlanta and you mentioned Selma as ironworks. What other ironworks did the Confederacy have?
Tredegar in Richmond.
Yeah.
They had some small foundries in Charleston, but they couldn't roll iron plate. There are three main places they had, and Selma was being developed. So really, if you want to get iron plate, you got to go to Atlanta or to Richmond. And now think about that. I need Brook guns down in Charleston. Just think of the railroad having to take it down to those places. That's why Selma was developed as a gun factory, because it was a more centralized location with a railroad railroad network, like the potholes on J. Clyde Morris here in Newport News. So you got that picture. Those who live here. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Thank you. If there are not any other questions, I want to. Oh,
I'm good. I'm good
okay.
to go.
I know you're good. But I want to thank you all very much for attending today. I have to tell you, on March, I think it's 7th, I'll be giving a lecture about who won the Battle of Hampton Roads. I then will be giving a lecture the next day with my co-author of my recent book, from Ironclads to Admiral, the bio of John Lomer Worden, commander of the Monitor. So, which will be my co-author is a great guy, and former worked at the Library of Congress and all that sort of stuff. So he was a perfect person for me to work with. So I thank you all very much for being here today.